I still remember the night I got the call. It was late, well past midnight, the kind of hour when only the truly desperate or the downright dangerous would call the precinct. I was sitting at my desk, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to wrap up the paperwork from a burglary case. The phone rang, slicing through the silence like a knife. "This is Officer James Walker," I answered, my voice steady, though I felt a pang of irritation. The voice on the other end was shaky, barely above a whisper. It was a young woman. "Please, you have to come. There's something in my house. It's not human." My first instinct was to brush it off as a prank or a case of someone high out of their mind. We get calls like that all the time. But there was something in her tone, raw fear. It wasn't the kind of fear you could fake. "What's your address, ma'am?" I asked, grabbing my notepad. She rattled off an address in a quiet suburb on the edge of town. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it had a reputation for strange things. People talked about lights in the woods, odd sounds at night, stories you'd hear around a campfire but never take seriously. "Stay where you are. Lock the doors." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, I said, already grabbing my jacket. The drive to her house felt longer than it should have. The streets were eerily empty, and the soft glow of the street lights barely penetrated the dense fog that had rolled in. My cruiser's headlights cut through the mist, but it felt like something was watching me from the shadows. When I arrived, the house stood in darkness except for a single flickering porch light. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like the calm before a storm. As I approached the door, I noticed claw marks on the wooden frame. They weren't the kind you'd see from a dog or any animal I could think of. I knocked on the door, my hand instinctively resting on the grip of my flashlight. "Police, open up." The door creaked open, revealing the young woman from the call. She was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her hands trembled as she gestured for me to come inside. "You're safe now," I assured her, stepping into the dimly lit living room. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, a chill ran down my spine. The room was a mess. Furniture was overturned, picture frames shattered, but it wasn't just the chaos that unnerved me. It was the writing on the walls, words, symbols, scribbled in what looked like ash and blood. "It started an hour ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it started knocking." "Knocking?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "On the walls, on the windows. But no one was there," she whispered, her eyes darting to the staircase. "And then I heard it, upstairs." I followed her gaze, my stomach tightening. "What did you hear?" "It was laughing," she said, her voice cracking. "But it wasn't human. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Stay here," I ordered, pulling out my flashlight and unholstering my sidearm. As I climbed the stairs, each step creaked under my weight. The air grew colder with every step, and I could feel an oppressive presence pressing down on me. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out like a tunnel, the shadows seeming to move on their own. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, swinging slightly as if beckoning me. I pushed it open with my foot, flashlight sweeping the room. It was empty, but then I saw it. A figure in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. Its form was twisted, unnatural, like a shadow given life. And then it moved. The laugh, the same inhuman laugh the woman described. It echoed around me, making my blood run cold. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. But as I turned, I saw something written on the mirror in what looked like blood. "You can't save her." The rest of the night would change everything I thought I knew about the world and my job. I rushed back down the stairs, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of that house, to call for backup, to do anything but stay. But the look in the young woman's eyes, pure, unfiltered terror, kept me rooted. She was standing in the middle of the living room, clutching a framed photo to her chest, Her hands shook so violently I thought she might drop it. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd just seen? A twisted shadow, words scrawled in blood, that laugh. None of it made sense, and I was starting to question my own sanity. "Nothing," I lied. "But I need you to tell me everything that's been happening here. Leave nothing out." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "It started 3 days ago. At first it was just small things. Objects moving on their own, lights flickering. I thought it was an electrical problem, maybe my imagination. But then, it got worse." Her gaze drifted toward the kitchen. "Last night, I was cooking dinner, and the stove turned on by itself, full flame. I tried to turn it off, but the knobs wouldn't move. And then I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. I followed her eyes, glancing toward the staircase, now shrouded in shadow. "Did you see anything?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "But I felt it. It was watching me. I could feel it breathing on the back of my neck." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before they came back on. The woman screamed, clutching my arm. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I scanned the room, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The furniture seemed to shift, as if something unseen was brushing past it. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood coming from the kitchen. "Stay here," I ordered, drawing my sidearm. I moved cautiously toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't coming from the floor or the walls, it was coming from inside the cabinets. I reached for the nearest cabinet door, steeling myself for whatever was inside. With one swift motion, I pulled it open. Nothing, just empty shelves. The scratching stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt louder than any noise. I turned to leave, but then something caught my eye. On the counter, a single knife stood upright, balanced impossibly on its tip. It toppled over as I approached, clattering loudly against the countertop. That's when the air shifted, cold, heavy, oppressive. It felt like the house itself was breathing. And then I saw it, the reflection in the microwave door. It was behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the air, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the faint sound of that same inhuman laugh echoing from upstairs. I ran back to the living room. The woman was no longer standing by the couch. She was huddled in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering under her breath. "It won't let me leave," she said over and over. "It won't let me leave." I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me. We're going to get out of here right now." She shook her head violently. "It won't let us. It wants us here. It feeds on us." Before I could respond, the front door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the house, followed by a series of loud knocks, rapid, aggressive, coming from every wall, every window. The woman screamed, covering her ears, and I found myself shouting over the noise, though I wasn't sure what I was saying. My voice was drowned out by the cacophony, and then just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence was suffocating, and that's when the footsteps began, slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. Each creak of the wood felt like a dagger in my chest. I aimed my flashlight at the staircase, my hand trembling. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the stillness. The footsteps stopped. Halfway down the stairs, a figure stood, cloaked in shadow. Its outline was human, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it spoke. "You can't save her," it said, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. Before I could react, the figure lunged toward me, and the lights went out. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness,
and the sound of my own panicked breathing. And then the lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. The woman was unconscious on the floor, her face pale. I scooped her up and ran for the door, which miraculously opened this time.
As I carried her outside, the oppressive weight lifted, the cold dissipating as soon as we crossed the threshold. I placed her in the back of my cruiser, slamming the door shut before collapsing against the hood, gasping for air. I looked back at the house. The porch light flickered once, twice, and then went out. Whatever was in that house wasn't finished with us, and I knew I'd have to go back. I sat in the cruiser, staring at the house, its dark windows like empty eyes staring back at me. The woman in the back seat stirred, groaning softly as she came to. I leaned over to check on her. "Are you okay?" I asked, though I wasn't sure what okay even meant after what we'd just been through. She opened her eyes, her gaze distant. "You can't leave it," she muttered, almost in a trance. "It will follow." Her words sent a chill through me. I glanced back at the house. The oppressive feeling hadn't left. It clung to me, a cold, invisible weight. She was right. Whatever was in there wasn't done with us, and if it didn't stay behind, it might spread. "I'll be right back," I said, grabbing my flashlight and sidearm. "Don't go back in there," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "You don't understand. It's not just the house. It's in you now." Her words stopped me cold, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something in me, maybe it was duty, maybe sheer stubbornness, refused to let this thing win. I stepped out of the cruiser, the night air biting against my skin. The fog had thickened, wrapping the house in a ghostly shroud. My footsteps felt heavy as I approached the door, which was now slightly ajar, as if inviting me back inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the house into silence. I gripped my flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the darkness. The symbols on the wall seemed to glow faintly now, pulsating like they were alive. "You want me?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. "Come and get me." The laugh returned, low and guttural, echoing from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence pressing down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. And then it spoke. "You don't belong here, James Walker." It hissed, using my name. "But you've brought me out into your world, and now I will never leave." The voice was closer now, circling me, though nothing appeared in the beam of my flashlight. The walls seemed to shift and breathe, the symbols glowing brighter. I moved toward the stairs, drawn to the oppressive energy radiating from above. As I ascended, the temperature dropped with each step. My breath came out in clouds, and frost formed on the banister. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched impossibly long, the door to the master bedroom glowing faintly at the end. I forced myself forward, my steps echoing unnaturally. The moment I reached the door, it swung open on its own, revealing the room as it had been before, immaculate, untouched, except for the mirror. The words had changed. Where it once read, "You can't save her," it now said, "Join me." A dark shape materialized in the mirror, growing larger until it stepped out, its twisted form towering over me. It had no face, just a mass of shifting shadows, but its presence was overwhelming. I raised my weapon instinctively. "Stay back!" It laughed again, a sound that rattled my very bones. "You cannot fight me, mortal," it said. "I am older than this house, older than your world. You are nothing." But then I remembered something the woman had said. It fed on fear, and it had followed us because we were afraid. If fear gave it power, then maybe. I lowered my weapon and took a deep breath, forcing myself to stand tall. "You're right," I said, my voice steady. "I'm nothing, but you don't scare me." The entity froze, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "You hear me?" I said, louder this time. "You don't scare me. You're just a parasite, feeding on people who are too afraid to fight back." "Well, not me. Not anymore. The room began to shake, the walls cracking as the entity writhed and roared. "You dare defy me?" it screamed, its form shrinking as I stepped forward. "I do," I said firmly. "Now get out of this house. Get out of her life. You're done here." The symbols on the walls flared one last time before burning out, leaving scorch marks in their place. The entity let out a final deafening roar before collapsing in on itself, vanishing into the mirror. The glass shattered, and with it the oppressive energy in the room disappeared. The house was silent. I stumbled downstairs, my legs trembling. The air felt lighter now, cleaner. When I stepped outside, the fog was gone, and the night sky was clear. The woman was still in the cruiser, her eyes wide as I approached. "It's gone," I said, opening the door for her. She looked at me, disbelief and relief washing over her face. "How?" "I just stopped being afraid," I said simply. "I drove her to a friend's house that night and we filed the incident away as unexplained, but I knew the truth. There are things in this world we can't understand, things that defy logic, reason, and even faith. I haven't gone back to that house since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that laugh. And I wonder if it's really over, or if it's just waiting for the next person to cross its path." It was supposed to be a routine night shift at the station. Most of the guys had gone home, leaving just me, Officer Jake Harris, and my partner Lisa. Small-town policing usually doesn't serve up much excitement, and I liked it that way. But that night was different. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight as I leaned back in my chair, sipping lukewarm coffee. The station was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the vending machine in the corner. Lisa sat across from me, flipping through a file with an expression of pure boredom. Then the call came in. The static on the radio crackled before the dispatcher's voice broke through. "Unit 4, we've got a report of, suspicious activity at the old Millard farm. Caller claims there's strange noises and lights. Respond ASAP." Lisa raised an eyebrow at me. "The Millard farm? Isn't that place abandoned?" "It has been for years," I said, already grabbing my jacket. "Let's check it out." The drive out to Millard Farm was uneventful. The winding roads were cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the patrol car's headlights. As we approached the property, a sense of unease settled over me. The old farmhouse stood like a shadow against the night, its windows broken and its roof sagging from decades of neglect. We parked a little way down the gravel road and killed the lights. Lisa and I stepped out, flashlights in hand. The air was colder here, sharper somehow, and carried a faint metallic tang that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered. I froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I heard it, a faint, low hum, almost like chanting. It seemed to be coming from the barn. We exchanged a glance, neither of us wanting to admit the obvious. There was no way anyone should be here. We moved cautiously toward the barn, our boots crunching softly on the gravel. The closer we got, the louder the hum became. It wasn't just sound anymore. It felt like it was vibrating through the air, through my bones. I reached the barn door first. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of pale light spilling out. I motioned for Lisa to cover me as I pushed the door open with one hand, my flashlight in the other. What we saw inside stopped me cold. The barn was empty. No people, no animals. But the floor was marked with strange symbols, like something out of an old occult book. Candles lined the edges of the space, their flames flickering despite the lack of wind. At the center of the barn was an object I couldn't quite make out at first. It looked like an old mirror, its frame tarnished and cracked, but its surface, it wasn't reflecting us. Instead, it showed a swirling black void. Lisa gasped, stepping back. "What the hell is that?" I couldn't answer her. I was too focused on the mirror, or whatever it was. The hum had turned into a low, guttural growl, and the air around us seemed to thicken, pressing down like a weight. Then the mirror moved. Not physically, but the surface rippled like water, and something reached out. A shadow, long and clawed, stretching toward us. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. "Lisa, we need to get out of here, now." But before she could respond, the barn door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, plunging us into near darkness. The growl became a roar, and the shadow from the mirror lunged. I swear in that moment I felt something cold and sharp graze my arm, like claws raking across my skin. Lisa screamed, fumbling for her radio. "Dispatch, we need backup at Millard Farm," she yelled, her voice shaking. But all we heard in response was static. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The growl faded, the light from the candles dimmed, and the barn fell silent. Lisa and I stood there breathing hard, the only sound our own pounding hearts. When we finally dared to look back at the mirror, it was just that, a mirror, cracked and dusty, showing our pale, shaken reflections. But I swear, as we turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, "Don't come back." And I had no intention of ever doing so. When we got back to the station, neither Lisa nor I spoke much. The ride was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. My mind replayed everything that had happened in the barn, the strange symbols, the mirror, that shadow. None of it made sense, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we had seen something we weren't supposed to. Once inside, Lisa sat at her desk, rubbing her temples. "What the hell did we just walk into, Jake?" "I don't know," I admitted, sinking into my chair. But whatever it wasn't normal. Lisa nodded, her eyes dark with unease. "That mirror, it wasn't just an object. It felt alive." Her words sent a chill down my spine because she was right. I'd felt it too, something watching us, something aware. Just as I was about to suggest calling in reinforcements, or maybe even a specialist, the station's phone rang. Lisa answered it, her expression shifting from irritation to something closer to fear as she listened. She hung up and looked at me. "It's the dispatcher. We've got another call. Same area." I stared at her. "You're kidding me." She shook her head. "This time it's a couple who claimed they were driving past the farm and saw figures, like people, standing in the field, just staring at the barn." I didn't want to go back. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave it alone. But I was a cop, and it was my job to investigate. So with a heavy sigh, I grabbed my jacket and flashlight again. Lisa did the same, though her hands were trembling. The drive back felt different this time. The road seemed darker, the air heavier. By the time we reached the Millard farm, I had a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. We parked farther from the barn this time, not wanting to get too close too soon. As we stepped out of the car, I immediately noticed something was off. The air was colder than before, and the faint hum we'd heard earlier was back, only now it was louder. Lisa pointed toward the field. "There." I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. There were figures, at least a dozen of them, standing in a loose circle around the barn. They weren't moving, just standing there, their faces turned toward the structure. "Who are they?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, gripping my flashlight tightly. "But we need to find out." We approached cautiously, calling out to the figures. "This is the police. Identify yourselves." No response. As we got closer, I realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. The figures weren't people. They were shadows, vague humanoid shapes, but with no discernible features. Just darkness. Lisa stopped dead in her tracks. "Jake, this isn't right. We need to leave." She was right, of course, but something compelled me to keep going. I stepped closer, my flashlight cutting through the dark. When the beam hit one of the shadowy figures, it dissipated instantly, like smoke in the wind. That's when the barn door creaked open.
flashlights trained on the door. It swung open slowly, revealing the same dim light we'd seen earlier. "Jake," Lisa said, her voice tight. "We shouldn't go in there again." "I know," I said, but my feet were already moving. The barn felt different this time, heavier, darker, like the air itself was pressing down on us. The symbols on the floor were still there, but now they glowed faintly, as if pulsing with some unseen energy. The mirror stood in the center, just as we'd left it, but its surface was no longer cracked and tarnished. Instead, it was smooth and polished, reflecting the barn's eerie glow. And then I saw it. In the mirror's surface, there was a figure, a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He stood perfectly still, staring straight ahead, but not at me, at something behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Lisa grabbed my arm. "Jake, we need to leave. Now." But I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the mirror, on the man who now seemed to be looking directly at me. His eyes, if you could call them that, were nothing but hollow, empty sockets. Yet I felt his gaze piercing through me. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a human face. Too wide, too sharp, too wrong. The hum in the air grew louder, turning into a low, guttural sound that rattled my bones. The light in the barn flickered, and the symbols on the floor began to shift and writhe as if alive. Lisa was shouting something, but her voice was drowned out by the noise. The man in the mirror raised a hand, pointing at me, and I felt a cold rush of air slam into my chest, knocking me backward.
When I hit the ground, the mirror shattered, the sound like a thunderclap that echoed through the barn. The figures outside vanished, the hum stopped, and the barn went dark. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Lisa's flashlight beam found me. She was shaking, her face pale. "Jake, let's go, please." I nodded, my body trembling as I got to my feet. We didn't say a word as we left the barn and got back into the car. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the road, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of him. Back at the station, Lisa and I sat in stunned silence. The events at the Millard farm had shaken us to our core, but as much as we wanted to forget it and move on, we both knew that wasn't an option. Something about that place wouldn't let us go. Just as I was about to suggest calling in a more experienced team, the lights in the station flickered. At first, I thought it was just a power surge. It wasn't uncommon during storm season. But then the phone on my desk rang. The sound startled both of us. It wasn't the usual station line. It was an old rotary phone mounted on the wall, a relic from decades past. I didn't even know it still worked. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Do we even have a line connected to that thing? Lisa shook her head, her face pale. No one's touched it in years? The phone continued to ring, each shrill tone cutting through the silence like a blade. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. "Hello?" For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice, low, raspy, and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come back." A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, though my voice wavered. The static grew louder, drowning out the voice, and then the line went dead. I set the receiver down slowly, my hand trembling. Lisa stared at me, her eyes wide. "What did they say?" "They told us we shouldn't have come back," I muttered, my voice barely audible. Before Lisa could respond, the station's main door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We both jumped to our feet, drawing our weapons instinctively. The room grew colder, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness, and then we heard it, the hum. It started faint, like before, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. The lights flickered again, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. "Jake," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "It's here." I didn't need her to explain. I could feel it. the same presence we'd encountered at the barn. It was here, with us, in the station. The hum turned into a low growl, and the shadows coalesced into a figure. It was the man from the mirror, his hollow eyes staring at us, his too wide smile stretching across his face. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the room. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and Lisa gasped as her flashlight flickered and died. The shadows around the man seemed to come alive, snaking toward us like tendrils. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. "You shouldn't have come back," the man repeated, his voice reverberating in my skull. I raised my gun, aiming at the figure. "Stay back." Lisa did the same, though her hands were shaking so badly that the barrel of her weapon wobbled. The man tilted his head almost mockingly, and then he lunged. The shadows surged forward, engulfing us in darkness. I felt a cold, sharp pain in my chest, as if something was trying to pull me apart from the inside. Lisa screamed, her voice raw with terror, and then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The lights came back on, the shadows retreated, and the man was gone. Lisa and I were left standing in the middle of the room, shaken and gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following days after the encounter at the station were a blur. Lisa and I went over everything again and again, trying to make sense of what had happened. The man in the barn, the shadows, the phone call. It all felt like pieces of a nightmare that wouldn't let go. But the truth was, neither of us knew where to start. We tried to file reports, but there were no leads, no evidence, nothing but our word. The Millard farm, once a crumbling relic, seemed to have vanished from the town's memory entirely. I couldn't even get anyone to look into the old rotary phone that had called us. It had simply been disconnected. Despite all the unanswered questions, something inside me urged me to stop digging, to walk away. I was done with the farm, the mirror, the shadows. But there was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, one I couldn't ignore. We tried to return to some sense of normalcy, to focus on our duties, but the memory of that night was too fresh. The look in the man's eyes, the darkness that seemed to stretch beyond our understanding, it haunted me. I never told anyone else what had really happened. Not the officers at the station, not even my family. How could I? They wouldn't believe me. And frankly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself anymore. But every now and then, when I sit alone in the dark, I hear that hum, low and distant, just enough to send a chill down my spine. I've tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it's just the wind or a trick of the mind. But deep down, I know the truth. That thing, the man, the mirror, the shadows, they're still out there, watching, waiting, and someday they might come for me again. I don't know what to do with that knowledge, but I do know this. Whatever it was we saw, whatever it is still lurking out there, it's not finished, and I'm not sure if anyone will ever be ready for what's coming next. So if you ever hear strange noises coming from the woods or see lights flickering in the distance, know this. Don't go looking for answers, because sometimes it's better to leave the darkness alone.